Good Yom Tov, everyone. Up until a few days ago, I had planned to speak about another topic on this holy day of Yom Kippur. But a number of congregants have spoken with me about their concerns leading up to the high holidays in general, and in particular, leading up to Yom Kippur. It is vital to respond to these concerns this year because I think that many of us may be feeling similarly at this time. Congregants have shared with me how they have been ill at ease with themselves or with their performance in daily life during this past year and a half. They feel they are not conducting their affairs at the level at which they should be. Some have been questioning themselves. Why am I not living up to my normal standards of living? Why am I not being as productive as in past years? Why am I not feeling as compassionate as I usually do? Why am I not connecting with Judaism or with God as I often do during the high holidays? One person shared with me how, as a child, they used to love going to high holiday services with their parents. They always felt a deep connection to Judaism and in particular to God on these holy days. And yet now they are at home and they were going back and forth as to whether to even bother turning on the computer to connect to our high holiday services this year. Not only did they feel a disconnect in terms of not being physically present with others at shul, but they also felt a certain type of disconnect between themselves and God. And they were upset with themselves for feeling this way. This is not to say that all of us are being critical of ourselves, or that all of us are feeling disconnected from prayer or from God. But there are a number of us who are feeling this way, and so it is vital to address this. There is also a broader theological question here which relates to this very day of Yom Kippur. What is our understanding of God and judgment? Today is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and yet it is often seen as Yom Hadin, the Day of Judgment. Today, I would like to focus on our understanding of judgment, how it relates to the concerns of a number of our congregants in this time we are living, and how judgment relates to Yom Kippur. When I mentioned to my father that I was thinking of doing a sermon on judgment, he jokingly said that I should just share the famous sermon preached by preacher John Edwards in 1741, just 280 years prior to today. Known as one of the most famous American sermons, it is called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That sermon certainly deals with the topic of judgment, but ultimately, I didn't think that it was a good match for our congregation. Among other things, the sermon takes about 45 minutes, and I felt that that would be just a bit too long. But more than that, I couldn't help but notice that its theology is drastically different from ours. The sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, repeatedly highlights a theology where all of humanity is pictured as hanging over the precipice of hell. And only by the grace of God in this particular moment do we not plunge into the depths of the fiery furnace. The solution to this unpleasant predicament naturally fits with John Edwards' theology. And so he notes that if one believes in a particular individual, then they will be saved from that dire fate. The name of the sermon highlights its theological presumptions about God and the world in which we live. As we can see from its title, the sermon understands God as angry, harsh, and exacting in judgment of humanity. Does this fit with our theology in Judaism? We do have prayers in Judaism from the Middle Ages, like the prayer Unatane Tokef, which we will sing shortly, which talks about us passing before God like sheep before a shepherd, and God, as the shepherd, makes decisions about who will live and who will die, how long we have, and in what way we will meet our end. But here our theology is different. Rather than using the fires of hell as motivation for us to believe in an individual, Jewish prayers like Unatane Tokef push us to think about how we live today, with the understanding that life is limited and that we must make the most of the moment we have been given. How do we do that? As the prayer says, through teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah, by becoming better people, by our prayers, and by giving to others. This is the way to live the brief life that we have been given. The focus is not on a lake of fire. Rather, the focus is on the brevity of life and how we should live while we have the chance. And in this prayer of Unatane Tokef, God is not pictured as an angry God. Indeed, the prayer says that God is hard to anger and easy to appease. It quotes Ezekiel 18 that God does not wish that we should die, but rather that we should do tshuva and truly live. God's judgment is about how we will live now. God wants us to truly live in this life, to live a good and moral life where we strive to be a blessing in our world. There are many metaphors for God, like the shepherd in Unatane Tokef. One of the most powerful metaphors for me is that of parent. And God, like a loving parent, wants us to turn back to the good path and live. The Torah powerfully states, Banim atem l'Adonai Elohechem, you are children of Hashem, your God. We are God's children. And what kind of judgment should a parent have for their child? Certainly, we should want our children to grow and develop, to learn and to be the best that they can be. And we want our children to be mensches, good people in our world. But how harshly do we judge them for each and everything they do? If they are absorbed in their book and do not come promptly for dinner, would we send them into a fiery furnace of hell? God forbid. But what if they color on the walls? Would that be a reason for eternal damnation? Maybe. No, I'm just joking. Certainly not. Although, thank God, and the fine inventors at Crayola, there are now washable markers. When our children yell at their siblings, is that the time for eternal punishment? No. That is a time for learning, an opening for discussion, a time for reflection on how they ought to do things differently in the future. It is certainly not deserving of eternal damnation. Sometimes children are just tired and grouchy because they didn't sleep enough the night before. And as sometimes happens when they get tired and grouchy, they make poor decisions. Sometimes we adults make poor decisions because we too are not at our best. Yes, both children and certainly adults must strive to make good choices and conduct their lives appropriately, but context must also be taken into consideration. So when I hear congregants share how they are not meeting their own standards, how they may have been a little more irritable this past year, how they currently feel less connected with God, or how they are unable to muster their usual amount of compassion for others, it is understandable. If my children at the end of a long day are a little out of sorts, how much more so might we be a little out of sorts, given the prolonged pandemic in which we are living? The word that I want us to hold on to this Yom Kippur day is the word context. In Judaism, God is called Dayan HaEmet, the true judge. A true judge does look at the deeds done, but also recognizes the context in which they are done. An Olympic runner may run a superb time on a level track, but can we judge them by the same standard if the track is wet in some places, rocky in others, and muddy and slippery as well? With what standard are we executing judgment? What might, out of context, look like a terrible time on the track could in fact be a world record running a very bumpy and difficult course. Are we taking context into account when we evaluate ourselves? The Talmud notes that we are not angels. We do not live in an angelic environment. We do not inhabit a world in which the course that we run is level and smooth. No. Our earthly course is indeed a bumpy one under the best of conditions, and over this past year and a half, it has been even more challenging with extra pitfalls and slippery muddiness. I trust that God, as our holy parent, understands that we, like children at the end of a long day, may not currently be at our best. Now, that does not give us free rein to do whatever we like or to follow where our emotions lead us. Our prefrontal cortex still needs to do its best to have us act like mensches. We must strive to be as menschy as possible, even under the muddied circumstances in which we live. And sometimes God does give us a push or wants us to push ourselves to do better. But the push is never meant to push us down, but rather to push us back onto the right path. On the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read God's words in the Haftorah. Truly, Ephraim is a dear child to me. Whenever I have rebuked him, my thoughts would dwell on him still. That is why my heart yearns for him. I will receive him back in love. This is the theology of Tanakh. This is our understanding of how God relates to us as a loving parent who wants us to do what is right and good, who wants us to recognize when we have strayed from the path, who wants us to return and do well, who sees us as whole human beings, who sees what we are up against, and who receives us back in love. It is not God's judgment that I worry about on this day. It is our judgment of ourselves. Sometimes we struggle to see the wider view. We can be quite narrow and harsh in our judgment of both others and ourselves. Now, I want to state that self-reflection is crucial in Judaism. Like scientists, we should make an attempt, observe how things turn out, and adjust what we are doing to be better. This is part of learning. This is part of learning to walk the path of Torah and become a mensch in our world. In contrast, harshly judging ourselves is often not helpful to the process. There is a difference between seeking to make shifts in our behavior and between berating ourselves and putting ourselves down. One of my favorite prayers during this high holiday season is El Melech Yoshev. El Melech Yoshev, O Kisei Rachamim. It speaks about how God, as sovereign, sits on a throne of compassion. As sovereign, God may sit in judgment, but even in that judgment, God understands where we are coming from and what we are going through. That is what makes it a throne of compassion, a throne which sympathizes with what we are going through. Sometimes we do need a push to get things going in the right direction, but sometimes what we need is an understanding hug and a kiss on our kepi. I think that this year, that is what is most needed. We all could use a hug and a kiss on our kepi. Sometimes it's okay to let ourselves just be, to take a moment to catch our breath, to allow ourselves the space and time to rejuvenate. We must strive to run the race as best we can, but in this race of life, we must consider what God cares about, where God is looking. As the Tanakh says, Adonai ro'eh lelavav, God sees the heart. If we are trying, if we are striving to do our best in this time, then God will see that. On this day of Yom Kippur, let us not judge ourselves as to whether we finished the race with the same time as we had in previous years. Let us ask ourselves, is our heart directed in the right place? Are we trying our best under the circumstances? Are we being compassionate with others? Are we being kind to ourselves? It is upon this foundation that God, as a loving parent, evaluates us. So on this day of judgment, let us consider how we are judging ourselves. God sits on a throne of compassion. May we learn to do the same. On this day of Yom Kippur, may we evaluate ourselves in the light of this past year. May we continue to strive to be the best that we can be. May we lift ourselves up rather than dragging ourselves down. And may we give ourselves permission to breathe and to enter this new year refreshed as children of God. Good Yontiv, everyone, and Lashana Tova.